Our guest today is Alice Kessler-Harris, and she is going to be introduced by Sonia Michel. I would like to welcome everyone on behalf of the National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center. And I would like to add to tweak our ritual of asking everyone to introduce himself, herself, with their institutional affiliation by, I think it's very appropriate if you might like to say what notable work of biography you have recently read or reading. And I would say myself that Selina Hastings' biography of Somerset Maugham is one of the remarkable books in the last couple or so years. So let's begin with the former executive director of the American Historical Association.
Doesn't need introduction after that.
There you go.
Arnita Jones. I am, and I should say, I'll be teaching at Allen's shop in the fall at American University. But what I'm reading now is it's a biography. It's not a biography. It's got a biographical sketch, but it's Friedrich Meinecke's correspondence with his refugee students during and after World War II, and it's really, really fascinating.
You should say this is not mandatory. You may say that you've just come to heckle Alice. That would also be legitimate.
Alan Crowd. I teach history at American University, and the two biographies I've read recently are very season appropriate. One by Jane Levy on the life of Mickey Mantle, and the other on the life of Willie Mays.
Oh, wow.
He was quoting them in the stands on last Thursday opening day. I'm David Kyvig. I'm retired from Northern Illinois University, and I'm a former Wilson Fellow. And despite that, I haven't read a recent biography. Doing constitutional history is sort of distracting. But I have been reading an absolutely wonderful semi-autobiography by Abraham Verghese, Cutting for Stone, which is such a beautifully written book that it's wonderful for a broken-down historian trying to get his act back together.
Ronald Steele, University of Southern California, and the Wilson Center. I'll mention my favorite biography, which I read a long time ago, but have reread, Hadrian's Memoirs by Marguerite Yourcenar.
James Sang, IBM Research, retired. Larry Krause's new book on Richard Feynman.
Carol Sang, historian, retired, no affiliation. I'm currently reading Hilary Sperling's biography of Pearl Buck.
Philippa Strum from the Wilson Center. I haven't read a really good biography lately, but I'm working on one of Dorothy Kenyon. And Alice and Sonia may be the only people in this room to whom that name will mean anything, but the rest of you will know about her one day.
This is very interesting.
Jim Grossman from the American Historical Association, and actually I just, for the last few years, have been teaching a graduate seminar in American history and biography. And the three most successful ones that we used, this is team taught, are Richard White's biography of his mother, David Farber's biography of Alfred P. Sloan, and T.J. Stiles' biography of Jesse James. And those would be the three I would recommend.
I'm Mel Leffler from the University of Virginia and the Wilson Center, and the biography I most want to read is the one on Willie Mays. So, Alan, when you're finished, please give it to me.
Ashok Maharaj, Guggenheim Fellow at the National Air and Space Museum Smithsonian Institution. And currently I'm reading a couple of biographies. One is by Judith M. Brown on Jawaharlal Nehru, and also on Chester Bowles' autobiography, Promises to Keep.
I'm Monique Laney. I'm the Verville Fellow at the National Air and Space Museum, right next to Ashok. And I'm currently reading autobiographies. So one is by Anne Moody. I'm sure that's a classic. And then the other one I'm getting ready to read is Angela Davis. So I'm catching up.
Paul Foreman, cultural historian of science at the Smithsonian. The biography I've been most recently looking into is Stephen Luke's old biography of Emil Durkheim.
I'm an illiterate historian. Anna Nelson. Actually, I have read bits and pieces of biographies. From teaching a course I haven't taught in 4 years, so that has pretty much taken my reading time. But I will relate a story. Many, many years ago, a very good friend said to me, "You ought to read a biography of Ulysses S. Grant." I said, "What? A biography of Grant?" Never. But it was William McPherson's. And it was a wonderful book. And I think I have learned a lot from it over the years. So that's an old one, but a real one.
And a good one. Jim Banner, historian. I do a decent amount of pre-publication reviewing. And about 2 years ago, every 2 or 3 weeks, I was getting a biography of Jefferson, and then of Hamilton, and then of Gouverneur Morris, and there are 3 of Gouverneur Morris, and then of Jefferson again, maybe with Hamilton thrown in, and then Jefferson again. And I said to that publication for which I was doing the reviews that I did not want to receive a biography for 2 years, and I haven't. And I also took the self-denying ordinance not to read another biography for 2 years, so I can't help anyone.
I'm Dorothy Ross, emerita at Johns Hopkins, and for my doctoral dissertation many years ago, I did a kind of intellectual biography of G. Stanley Hall, and after I handed it in, I was told I really shouldn't have been allowed to do a biography for a dissertation. That it was, and when I asked why, I was told that it required a mature scholar. So I felt pretty good that I got it.
That's the point, actually.
I'm Phyllis Loeffler from the University of Virginia, and I've been reading a ton of autobiographies this year related to a project that I'm working on African American leadership. That project is an outgrowth of about a 10-year videotaped oral history project that I've done in collaboration with Julian Bond, and I guess some of the autobiographies that I have found most meaningful are those of people like Angela Davis, Janetta Cole, John Lewis.
Hi, my name is Keisha Lai, and I'm just an intern here for Marjorie Sprue, who is a scholar over here.
I'm Pilasiti Sudhir of the American Historical Association. I'm waiting to read Joseph Lillywell's new biography of Gandhi, which I just got a copy of, not least because I believe, I just heard, that it's already stirred up a controversy in India. Government's planning to ban it and so on.
Yes.
I'm Katha Wright. I'm Gavin Wright's wife, and I've just finished a memoir autobiography, Isabella Bird Among the Tibetans.
I'm Gavin Wright from Stanford and the Wilson Center, and I will read the biographies of Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, but I look forward to the one of Duke Snyder. So Boys of Summer is a kind of a collective biography of a baseball team. Yes.
I'm Miriam House Cunningham, and I am currently reading Allison of the National History Center. I'm reading Allison Weir's Henry VIII and His Court.
I'm Charles Mayer, currently a fellow here. I think the last biography was one I assigned, which was Marty Sherwin and Kai Bird's biography of Oppenheimer. Very good. But I would recommend this fantastic novel by Hilary Mantel, a biographical novel, Wolf Hall. Makes you feel nicely about Thomas Cromwell, and it's a great piece of work.
Hi, I'm Anand Toprani from Georgetown. I have ambitions once I finish my dissertation to write a biography of John Connolly of Texas, and I don't think I could find a better model for a political biography than Bob Caro's 3-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Oh, I think you're right. Hi, I'm Al Schmidt. I'm long a retired professor in history and law. I came to this because I'm doing my own biography, but it's not a narrative. For the last 15 years, I've been working, and I say this all very immodestly before this group, I've been working on a chronicle of my life each year of the 86, and I've put together about 4,000 pages so far, and I think it might be the basis, sometime in the future, maybe the next century or two, for the rough material for someone else's biography.
I'm Tim McDonald from the Wilson Center, and it's been many years since I read a biography. Sorry.
I'm Bob Hathaway at the Wilson Center. There was recently completed a new biography of my great-great-grandfather, who was a colonel in the Army of Northern Virginia. And so that was my most recent expedition into the world of biography. Unfortunately, unless you're related to me, you will have no interest in it. It's not a very good book.
Okay, Christian Osterman, I direct the History and Public Policy program here. My most recent biography was, or autobiography, was that of Markus Wolf, the East German spy master. Pass it on to you.
Joan Wages. I am president of the National Women's History Museum, and I am here to enlist the help of Alice Kessler-Harris, Sonia Michel, and Marjorie Spruill.
Marjorie Spruill, and I apologize for being late, but it was because I was just finished 2 hours ago reading a biography written by one of my graduate students whose dissertation defense started 2 hours ago, and we just finished. It was of Will Lou Gray, who was a pioneer in adult literacy programs for black and white South Carolinians in the mid-20th century, and I hope that you all get the chance to read it someday.
And I'm Sonia Michel, and I'm Director of U.S. Studies here at the Wilson Center. And the biography I'm currently reading is by my colleague Blair Rubel. It's called The Biography of U Street in Washington, D.C., and it's a wonderful book. Shall I go ahead and, okay, and I am going to have the supreme pleasure of introducing Alice Kessler-Harris. And if for no other reason, and I have many reasons to be happy to be Director of U.S. Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, it's that I can introduce my old friend and mentor and role model, Alice Kessler-Harris. I won't tell you how many years we've known each other, but we both have grown children who have 3 children of their own, and they played together each, and not together, and they played together when Alice and I first met each other. So it's been a long time. But Alice is, the role that she's played in my life is a role that I know she's played in the lives of many, many, many other women's historians and American historians. And that is as a pioneer, as a role model, as a source of inspiration and encouragement over the years. She's really been an amazing figure in the field of American women's history and American history. So it's really a pleasure to have and a privilege to have her with us today. Alice not only is a wonderful mentor and encourager, but her work has been pioneering in several different fields of women's history and American history. The titles of her books, I think, show the variety and the innovation and the innovativeness of her work. She was one of the first people who ever pointed out that women, in fact, have a history of labor, that women have always worked, as one of the titles of her books put it. And her first major monograph, Out to Work, A History of Wage Earning Women in the United States, was extremely comprehensive, innovative, full of inspiration, insight, and so forth into the many different ways in which women entered the paid labor force in the U.S. Across the centuries, and I think it was a model for women's labor history in many other countries as well. So that's been very important. But her work, and she's continued to do women's labor history, but she's also moved into the history of women in social policy, women in social rights, and her book, In Pursuit of Equity, Women, Men, and the Quest for Economic Citizenship in 20th Century America has been equally influential and important in sort of opening up that field and understanding the relationship between women, economics, politics, social policy, and so forth. And so she has a way of looking at different subjects that what might be thought of as conventional subjects and looking at it from the perspective of gender and really opening them up and showing why they're important in women's history and in mainstream history in general. And now she's done it again. She's moved into the field of biography. And yes, it does take a mature scholar at whatever age to do that. And now she's showing us, talking to us about the life of Lillian Hellman, who is certainly a remarkable figure in her own right. So it's really a privilege to have Alice here. And I know that she's going to be talking today, not just drawing on her work on Lillian Hellman, but kind of opening it up and thinking about Cold War history through the lens of Lillian Hellman. So please join me in welcoming Alice Kessler-Harris.
Thank you very much. It's really an enormous pleasure to be here and to see so many old friends and faces. I haven't seen Dorothy for years, and haven't seen Flip for more years. And anyway, it's very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I appreciated the going around the table and listening to all your favorite biographies. And I'm delighted to tell you that when I talk about this book and people say, "Are you writing a biography of Lillian Hellman?" I usually say, no. I'm not writing a biography of Lillian Hellman. At least I'm trying not to write a biography of Lillian Hellman. What I'm trying to do is something that I sometimes call a biographical study, but that at other times I call a biography not. That is, I deliberately have set out not to do what biographers often do, which is to explore the internal lives and existences of their subjects, but rather to, I sometimes describe it as seeing through Lillian Hellman, seeing through the subject to the 20th century. And my rationale for that, it may well be that, as Dorothy pointed out, I'm still intimidated by the same graduate school generation which told us that writing biographies was not something a serious historian did, because biography wasn't really history, we were told. And I must confess that a couple of years ago, when I published a piece at the AHR's, the American Historical Review did a kind of roundtable on biography and asked a number of historians who had never before written biographies to write about why we were writing biographies. And the first footnote that I dropped in that piece was to a former student of mine named Judith Babbitts, who I discouraged from writing a biography some 35 years ago, and she's never forgiven me for her. So the footnote was by way of apology that, you know, I had not only absorbed but passed on the lessons of my graduate career and passed them on in a way that did somebody else a disservice. So here I am I can't admit that I'm doing a biography, and if I am, it's a different kind of biography. So in that AHR piece, what I tried to do was to say that when historians wrote biographies, we used the biographical subject as the equivalent of what E.H. Carr might have called a fact. That is, that the object of our biography was not necessarily to study the subject, but to ask what the subject of the biography could tell us about a period, a moment, an event, whatever it is that we were looking at and were interested in. And that's how I think about that, this book about Lillian, that our subjects, if biography is what we're doing, our subjects are, in a sense, grist for the mill. That is, that the larger questions that we're asking are the questions to which we want answers. And we think that the facts, our subjects, can help us illuminate what those larger questions are. And that's what I mean by seeing through the life rather than examining the life per se. And you'll see that this is, for this purpose, Lillian Hellman is a perfect subject. And I'll explain why in a minute. First, I want to point out the photograph in the back, which she's not looking at you in this photograph, but I put this photograph here because this photograph was first published in Newsweek magazine in April of 1949, and it had underneath it a headline, and the headline said, "Mastermind." She was then accused, and accused is the right word, of being the mastermind of the famous Waldorf Conference, which some of you may remember was the Cultural and Scientific Congress, which a number of people organized in 1949, and that brought Soviet scientists, but also Soviet humanists, Shostakovich is probably the best known of them, to the U.S., along with their minders, a conference which was then boycotted by a number of people who described the conference as communist and communist-dominated, and whose boycott resulted in the emergence of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is the anti-communist group that emerges right out of or in opposition to the Waldorf. So here is Lillian Hellman, who is depicted as the mastermind of the conference. I want you to look at that photograph and then, hold on. But this is the one I want you to be aware of, because here she's looking right at you. And whatever it is that you think of that woman is what we're going to talk about after, or as I continue. It's those eyes that I want to be staring at you. So very briefly about Lillian Hellman, whom I think, well, let me give you a paragraph on Lillian Hellman, just in case. I won't embarrass anybody by asking if you've never heard of her. Lillian Hellman, born in 1905 in New Orleans, of German Jewish parents on both sides. On the one side, a rather old Southern family, came from Alabama. On the other side, less old, but still German Jewish Southern family. Moved to New York when she was about 6 or 7 years old, but then continued to spend summers in New Orleans and other parts of the South, Alabama, where her mother's family came from, and always imagined herself as a Southerner, and presented herself as a Southerner. That's something to sort of keep in mind as we move through this little talk. She grew up into the 1920s, and so was part of the flapper generation, and was, as a young woman, probably as close to identifiable as a flapper. That is, in her, in the years when she was 18, 19, 20 years old, she worked for an avant-garde publishing company, which did parties every other night where famous authors like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and so on came. She met them, she danced. I'm not going to ask or answer questions of what else she did with them. She married when she was about 20, and by the time she was about 24, she was contemplating divorce. She got divorced. Shortly after, she met Dashiell Hammett, whose name some of you may recognize as that of a rather well-known detective story writer. Her relationship with Dashiell Hammett lasted for the better part of 30 years, off and on. By the time she was 29, within a couple of years after she'd met Dashiell Hammett, she had her first play was produced on Broadway. The play's called The Children's Hour. And between 1929 and 1960, she wrote, produced had produced some dozen plays, all of which opened on Broadway. She was you might call it a popular playwright. Some people called her a middlebrow playwright because she didn't write for the experimental or left theater. She wrote for Broadway audiences. In 1952, at the height of her career as a playwright and a scriptwriter, I'd forgotten that piece of it. She made most of her money from writing scripts. She was called by the House Un-American Activities Committee and questioned about her communist background. I'm going to talk about communism in a second, so I won't go into that at the moment. It was, some say, her best moment. Because unlike many other people who were called, and like some of her very good friends, she refused to name names, and luckily for her, she didn't go to jail. We can talk about why not at some other point. For about 15 years after that, she remained something of a heroine, something of an icon. And then in the late 60s and early 70s, she began to publish a series of memoirs, An Unfinished Woman, a Pentimento, and the third of them, Scoundrel Time, is the one that's going to feature in our talk today. The Scoundrel Time was a memoir of her experiences before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And thereafter, her trajectory, her celebrity trajectory, quickly moved downhill, and she became a rather disliked woman, I should say. I'll talk a little more about what her personality was like in a little while. Suffice it to say that she was accused of being an unregenerate Stalinist, of lying. The subject of that famous Mary McCarthy comment, every word she says is a lie, including and the. And she died in 1984 fighting a lawsuit in which she had brought the lawsuit accusing Mary McCarthy of libel. She died in 1984, remembered as a Stalinist, a liar, an ugly woman. That word was used to describe her in print as an unpleasant, vituperative, strident, you name all the bad words that you can, and they were all applied to Lillian Hellman.
Alice, I want to make sure everyone can hear you at the end of the room. Can everyone hear? Okay.
You can't? Shall I speak a little more loudly?
But just bring the mic closer to you, if you can. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, that's good.
How's that?
That's good.
Yeah, that's much better.
Sorry. Shall I start all over again? Okay. So that's our Lillian Hellman, and that's her life. So the question that I ask in this biography, the question that I sort of set myself out to ask, is why this woman, whose sins I would readily admit, she was a communist. She did lie, like many people lied about her communist background. She exaggerated about many other things. She was in many ways, a fearful woman. She was vituperative. She swore. She cursed. She was unladylike, despite her Southern background. And yet, she was also, in many ways, a very positive woman. She was courageous. She fought the House Un-American Activities Committee. She was loyal to her friends. She was generous. She gave money freely to causes that she believed in. She was a great cook and a wonderful hostess. People loved to be with her. She was very funny. And yet Lillian Hellman goes down in history as an unregenerate Stalinist and as a liar. So the question I asked myself when I started to do this biography, and indeed the reason I decided to do it, was sort of wondering why, how we understand that question. And I have many explanations in answer to that, but one of those explanations lies in the politics of the moment. And because I know a lot of you are interested in Cold War and Cold War issues, I've chosen to focus on that explanation right now, or in this little talk. So I focus on that explanation because, as I see it, the moment that the Communist Party in the Soviet Union collapses, and communism gives way in the Soviet Union to whatever system now exists, which I don't really know what to call it, the moment that that happens, our sense of who Lillian Hellman was shifts and changes. And that struck me as a problematic that affected not only Hellman, but that indeed might well affect many biographies or many ways of looking at political people. So Eric Hobsbawm, famous historian who you all know, was recorded at one point as saying that the history of the short 20th century, that is 1917 to 1989, is a history of the confrontation with communism. That at some level, everybody who lived then and was in some ways political had to deal with communism, and equally important, those of us who are historians of that period and want to think about anything substantive in that period have to deal with the question of communism, whether or not we're confronting the subject directly. Hellman, she was born in 1905, reaches maturity in the 1920s. Her life encompasses most of the period of the communist regime, and she herself was politically involved in many different kinds of ways. If she were a biographical subject, which she was, before the wall fell, to some extent even afterwards, the questions we would be asking about her would be the questions that we have historically asked about people like Hellman, who were famous writers, politically active, public figures, etc., etc. Questions like, did she follow the party line? Was she actually in the party? What did she know and when did she know it? Was she simply an apologist for Stalin? Those kinds of questions. Did she come clean when she was asked? Did she repudiate communism in the 1950s and 60s? When did she withdraw from the party? In other words, the questions that we would be interested in would be questions that dealt with Hellman and Hellman's own life. And indeed, those are the questions that people have asked about her. And the answers to those questions have led people to conclude that she was an unregenerate Stalinist, a liar. Did she remain a fellow traveler all of her life? Was she a hero at that HUAC hearing, or was she simply covering up? That is, after all, she took the Fifth Amendment, which people sometimes did when they didn't want to tell the truth. By those standards and in the light of those questions, Hellman offers a relatively narrow canvas to paint on. That is, one can say, or I can say, what we might have been reluctant to say in 1988 or 1987, but probably could have said even then. Since then, we have some new material and some new information. And it's very clear at this point she was a communist. She did join the Communist Party. She joined for only a couple of years. She joined between 1939 and 1941. When she was called before HUAC, she did lie about her membership in the Communist Party. I often shrug my shoulders and say, well, did she have a choice? Did anybody have a choice at that point but to lie about party membership if one wanted to continue to earn a living in any way? You can also say about her that the likelihood is that she quit the party in 1943, or by 1943, that she was well out of it. She probably withdrew from the party late in 1941. By 1943, even the FBI, which had been tracking her before that, had stopped tracking her. And there are FBI records which demonstrate that they are writing to each other saying, well, she's not really that important. It's a waste of time to track her. They start tracking her again in 1949 as the Waldorf Conference opens. And by the time that conference opens in 1949, she's once again accused of being a communist. There's no evidence at that point that she was in the party at all. There are other things we can say about her. Did she lie? Yes, she lied. She lied about a lot of things. She lied about how well she knew Ernest Hemingway. She lied about running away from home when she was 12 years old and where she hid overnight and how many nights she stayed out. She lied about the fig tree. There's a famous fig tree that appears in her first memoir, which she claims to have climbed up in and fallen out of after watching her father begin a liaison with another woman, some famous. She was so angry with him that she fell out of the fig tree in which she was hiding. But, you know, that fig tree, which in that story appears outside her aunt's boarding house in New Orleans, in another story appears in Mississippi, and in yet a third place it appears in Alabama, same fig tree. Is that a lie or is that an exaggeration? About those kinds of things, she lies all the time. My guess is, and this is not to excuse her, that every memoirist lies about such things, but lie, yeah, she made herself, as one person said to me, the center of her own drama. When she's not accused of lying, she's accused of self-aggrandizing, putting herself in the middle of every story she wants to tell. Yes, she did. And when people attacked her and called her a self-aggrandizing person, there's no defense. She did self-aggrandize. One could go on. She was vituperative. She swore like a man. How's that for a shame on her, right? Unfair. But she did. She swore. She smoked like a chimney. She was often unkind. She was quick-witted, often took out her humor on other people. In other words, all these negative things that people accuse her of, I would say, she was a communist. So what? She was she did lie. Whether she lied about significant things or not, that's something for us to talk about. And I will talk about the Julia episode if some of you want to talk about it in a little while. For the moment, let me say only that the real question when we confront Hellman from a post-1989 or a post-fall period is not the question of whether or not she was a communist. So she was. The question is whether we can learn something from the way she behaved while she was in the party, when she was out of the party. Can we learn anything about what it meant in the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s to imagine yourself as a radical, as somebody who was an outsider from the mainstream? And maybe the other way to put this question is to ask, what do we lose? What do we miss when we see her only or primarily as a lying, stealing, thieving? She did those things too. I'll talk about that later. As a lying, stealing, thieving communist. In other words, when we look at her that way and shake our hands and say, yes, she was those things. I want to argue, and this is really a proposition I'm making to you to see if I can sell it, so you'll tell me if it's persuasive or not. I want to argue that if we put that aside, accept those things as being true, in this moment when the Cold War doesn't exist, when we're not quite as afraid of the label, when we as historians no longer have to place ourselves on one side or the other, we no longer have to be on one side or the other as we write and interpret, nor do we care too much whether our subjects were on one side or the other, that we might actually learn something more about what it meant to be left, radical, in opposition in those years. And that's the thing that I think that we are enabled or free to do, and have been free to do for the last 2 decades. So maybe the simple way to put this is to ask, what do her political commitments, what do her political stances tell us about communism, if you like, or radicalism in the 20th century? What can we learn if we stop focusing on the was she or wasn't she question? So I want to suggest 4 arenas from which we can learn. I think there are more of them, but I'm going to focus on 4 of them for purposes of argument. The first thing I want to suggest is that we can learn something about the complexity of the left in the 20th century. That Hellman's politics, and particularly her politics with relationship to communism, are part of what we often call popular front politics. And generally in those years before the fall of the wall, if you like, or the Iron Curtain. You can't talk about falling curtains, can you? Because that closes things off. What's the metaphor? Before the collapse of the Iron Curtain. How's that? When we speak about the Popular Front, we accompany it in 20th century American history with a caveat about, of course we know the Popular Front was led by the Communist Party, and therefore everybody who was in it was in or close to the Communist Party, and its politics were governed by Moscow. Maybe, but probably not. What we know about the Popular Front and what we learn when we look at what Hellman is actually doing in the 30s, for example, when she is certainly not a member of the party, But she is involved in many activities, including the organization of the Screenwriters Guild, which she did with John Howard Lawson, who was a member of the Communist Party. When she goes to Spain, where she meets and hangs out with Ernest Hemingway and comes back and writes very sympathetically about Spain, the Spanish Republicans, and the Spanish refugee problem, and then devotes pretty much all the rest of her life, some piece or another, to raising money for the Spanish refugees. She's a member of the Joint Anti-Fascist Refugee Committee. She's a founder of the Spanish Refugee Aid subcommittee of that committee, and so on. All of this she does out of commitment. All of this she does not because she's a member of the party, but because she, like millions of other members of the Popular Front, really believe in one element or other of the social justice agenda that various socialist, social democratic, sometimes anarchist groups had. But if we take Lillian Hellman's activities seriously and look at them, we see through her a Popular Front which for sure had communists in it in various capacities, but in which millions of people, some ordinary people and some celebrity people, were acting in response to a movement for and towards social justice that came out of hundreds of different corners of their lives. To accept the assumption that these groups, I could name hundreds of them, but I'm sure you can all too, including a lot of the CIO unions and so on, to accept the assumption that these groups were necessarily led by, monitored by, in response to communists who were under the guidance of the Soviet Union, is to condemn about a quarter of the American voting population in the 1930s as somehow subversive. And if we do that, what that does is to distort what's going on in the 1930s. It blinds us to the fact that about a quarter of the American population, which in some way or the other, through the trade union movement, through political movements, through the American Labor Party, which emerges later, and so on, are in some way subversive. They work with communists, but are they subversive? Can we not and should we not allow Hellman's view of these groups, sometimes critical, sometimes cooperative, sometimes going her own way, sometimes separating from them? Shouldn't we learn from that there is a Popular Front mentality in the United States, which does have, not always integrated, but some more general view of social justice, which is denied by those who would deny or those who would insist on commitment to communism as the only thing that we look at. Pulls back from that group, and in that group, many members of that group were her friends, arguing that such an anti-communist stance would capture within it the numbers of people who wished to say their piece, but who would be chilled, would be unable to say it because they would fear not being sufficiently anti-communist. So an anti-communist stance, she thought, was a trap which would silence people who might otherwise speak. And I have to say that the argument that she made was an argument that many good people agreed with. including a lawyer. She hired as a lawyer when she was called before HUAC a very famous liberal named Joseph Rao, who was himself a member of the ADA, the Americans for Democratic Action, and who had decided never to defend communists before, never to help communists, because he was an anti-communist. But he agreed to defend her, and he agreed to defend her because he said he agreed with her that her acts, that what she was being accused of, was not acting on anything, but simply having ideas that people did not like. And those ideas, he believed, did not and should not subject an individual to attack. Rao later defended Arthur Miller, and Miller used the same defense. Neither, although Miller was convicted, she was sent to jail, though he never served his jail term. It was overturned procedurally. Hellman was not. She got away with it. Anti-communism, Hellman thought, was merely capitulating to the enemies of dissent. Dissent was the fountain of democracy. You couldn't have democracy without defense. Anti-communism was simply just one way of curbing one form of dissent. For liberals to succumb, when liberals succumbed to that form of constraining speech, Hellman withdrew. She would no longer call herself a liberal, though she had earlier done so. And it was then that liberals turned into her worst enemy. Those of you who've read Scoundrel Time or followed her history will know that when 25 years later she published a book which described her experiences, she did not in that book attack HUAC. She did not attack Joseph McCarthy. She dismissed the committees, the investigatory committees of the government, arguing that they were criminals, they were stupid people, they were beneath contempt, they didn't deserve discussions. It was the liberals who she wept about, the people who should have been speaking up on behalf of dissenters, on behalf of free speech, on behalf of civil liberties. It was they, she thought, were, had betrayed her, and it was those people who then turned against her in the late 1970s. More of that. That's a complicated story. Here's a place where Hellman's personality gets in the way, because maybe had Hellman been a male, I don't know, she might have got away with it. But certainly had she been a feminine woman, she might have got away with it. As it was, she called people on the carpet in the 50s, in the 60s, and again, and finally in the 1970s. And she did so in her normal, vituperative, angry, finger-waving, moralistic style. A style which, because she was a woman, she couldn't get away with at all. I can't think of an example of a male who does a similar thing. Most people would have kept quiet, but Hellman couldn't keep quiet. Arthur Miller kept quiet and later wrote a little paragraph in his autobiography, Time Bends, in which he expressed his admiration for her for not keeping quiet, though he could not have done so. Okay, 2 more points, and then I'm going to stop. Third point, again, on the question of what do we open up? In the post-1989 world, Lillian Hellman tells us something about how identity plays out in a world where identities and identity politics has become a powerful force. So you can see in Lillian Hellman's life, when you stop seeing her as a communist, that big C word, you can see in her a lot of other things which she did not deny, and would not act on politically. One of these was being a Jew. She is often accused, in fact, of being a non-Jewish Jew or an anti-Semitic Jew, and there's a famous incident around Anne Frank, which we can talk about, in which the relationship between her Jewishness and her communism comes to the fore. But the fact is that Hellman consistently, from her youth on, would say things like, I'm glad I was born a Jew, but what does it matter, right? It doesn't influence anything I do or anything I say. I don't think as a Jew. She said the same thing about being a woman. I don't think as a woman. I don't write plays as a woman. I write plays as a human being, as a person. I respond to the world. I respond to Hitler. I respond to fascism, not as a Jew, but as a person. She always denied that identity politics held sway with her. She campaigned on behalf of racial integration, especially racial integration in the armed forces. During the Second World War, she held hands with, literally as well as figuratively, with Paul Robeson. They appeared on platforms together. She always insisted that the cause of racial equality was as important to her as any other cause, and more important in terms of the way she worked for it than the cause of women's equality, for example, which she put on the back burner. I think when you can start looking at Hellman's life and thinking about the way she put identity politics behind her, instead of thinking about her as the communist acting on communist orders, we begin to understand that this was not Hellman's stance alone. This was the stance of many people in the generation from which she came. And finally, there's the question of money. Lots of people say her plays are about money. They are, in large measure. And the pre-1989 interpretation of her plays, especially of The Little Foxes, is that it's anti-capitalist. That's the way people read that play. It's anti-capitalist because it deals with greedy industrialists trying to exploit poor people, especially poor black people in the South, etc. Hellman never acknowledged, she acknowledged that that interpretation had been made, but she always dismissed that interpretation because in her eyes, the play was not at all a question about a question of money. It was a play about human nature, about trust and mistrust within families, about corruption and the ways in which money corrupted the soul, about the absence of tradition and concern for tradition. In her eyes, she had never written an anti-capitalist play, though she would have said that she didn't believe that capitalism was a fair or a just system if you'd asked her. Rather, what she claimed was that she was not antagonistic to money per se. She was antagonistic to the way it was used to exploit certain people and individuals. So she herself lived a lifestyle which could only be described as extravagant. You know, country houses, city houses, servants in both places, mink coats, jewelry, love of expensive presents, expensive trips. It was an extravagant lifestyle. And those who see her as a communist accuse her of hypocrisy. How could somebody live such an expensive lifestyle and yet claim to be an egalitarian of any kind, they ask. In fact, in Lillian's eyes, because the difficulty with money was exploiting people with it, she was not at all a hypocrite. She had servants, she paid them well, she paid for their health insurance, she paid for their unemployment insurance. She did what people rarely do, you know, filed a quarterly return for all her household help, saying how much she had paid and giving them workman's compensation, for example, when they got ill. She wanted what was due her, but she also wanted what was due to them. She often treated the people who worked for her miserably because she was a miserable person. So she screamed and yelled at them the way she screamed and yelled at her editors and her male friends and anybody else who came within screaming range. But they screamed back at her frequently, and the relationship thus was loud and uncomfortable. But it didn't fall into the perspective of an inegalitarian relationship. It was not hypocritical as she saw it. There's a coda to this, which is that in the post-war world where affluence has become a kind of substitute for citizenship, she played that game. That is, she understood that celebrity, money, voice would bring her certain kinds of things that she could not always get. And she used that voice to its fullest extent. She organized her friends brought them to fundraising parties for whatever the causes were that she was fighting for, whether it was Henry Wallace or Spanish refugee aid, or in the 1970s she became the founder and motivator of the Committee for Public Justice, which is the committee that got Nixon to reveal or the White House to release the Nixon tapes, for example. So she felt as though she was a moral voice and that she could use her money that way. So it's not different if you, it's different, the purposes for which she uses it are different, but, well, I was going to say I'd rather have Lillian using her money her way than the Koch brothers using their money their way, but that's beside the point. So, okay, to bring this then to a swift conclusion, I hope it's clear that I don't want to recuperate Lillian in any traditional sense. I'm perfectly willing to admit that she was all the bad things everybody says she was. But I think it's precisely because she was those things that we can learn something from her. And that if we stop at, oh, she was such a horrible person, oh, she was so ugly, oh, she was a communist, oh, she was a liar, if we stop there, we don't learn anything from that life experience. I think that if we move beyond that, we get to see not only a different kind of Lillian, but we also get to see something about the dynamics of 20th century American society as it actually functioned for the people who were living it. Okay, I'm going to stop.
Thank you very much.
Non-biography. Sorry to have gone on.
I must say myself that I find the pre- and the post-1989 approach very, very useful. Questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. One of the things that you said at the outset in describing one of the adjectives you used was fearful, and yet you really didn't come back to that in anything else you said. You said she was courageous, outspoken, even profane, and I'm just wondering, what did she fear, if anything? I don't hear a thing about her fearing anything. It sounded like she was a very forceful advocate for various causes.
Yes, she was a very forceful advocate for various causes, and she was also what the psychiatrists sometimes call counterphobic. So she often did what she was most afraid of doing, and the HUAC hearing is an example of that. So she gets called before HUAC in May of 1952 is when her hearing is. She's called a couple of months before that. May of 1942, think about what's happening. First of all, her partner, Dashiell Hammett, has just the previous December come out of jail, where he was sent for refusing to name names. The Rosenbergs are sitting in jail they've already been convicted, but they're waiting out their moment until they're sentenced. The McCarthy furor is at its height. It's been directed largely at people just like her, who have then disappeared, gone off to England, lost their livings, jumped out of their apartment buildings because they couldn't live. So she is terrified. She's terrified of how she's going to be treated. She's terrified of losing her living, which is another piece of her personality, because she is essentially a woman alone and supporting herself, and by 1952 supporting Hammett, whose income has been taken away by the IRS. There's a word for that, but Hammett has lost his income, so he has none. All his royalties have been sequestered by the IRS, so she's supporting him. She's in a position where she feels completely isolated, except she has good friends, she thinks. She is the most terrified of going to jail, which will happen to her if she doesn't name names. That's the routine. She won't name names. She won't name names. That's the one thing when she goes to Joe Rao, she says, I'll do anything, I'll go, I'll adopt whatever strategy you tell me to adopt, but I don't want to go to jail and I don't want to name names. And it's out of that strategy that her, so how do you want to describe her? She's clearly scared to death, but she acts in a very courageous way, in a way that most people, her buddy Clifford Odets, who was a close friend of hers, had just, 2 months before named names before the committee. Other people she'd worked with closely, Elia Kazan is the most famous, had called her up and said to her that he was going to name names. So she is both, I think.
Dorothy Ross.
That was really very interesting and very illuminating. And I was thinking as you were talking about the way you started your talk, about making a distinction between biography in terms of just the life as opposed to looking through the life to history. And it's very clear you're doing that, and it's very important to do that. But it struck me as you were going through that you really have to do the biography of the life at the same time, don't you? Because at every point you made, you were kind of weighing, judging her personality, and how it played historically. Is it her personality that's at fault, or is it certain cultural and political issues that are really being dealt with? So you can't get away from it.
Unfortunately, you're right. I can't get away with it, and I don't think I have. This book is getting close to the end right now. And in the end, I don't even wish I could get away with it. In the end, it's the both and that's so fascinating. It's the fact that this personality, which is so abrasive, so strident, so non-feminine or unfeminine in any traditional way. It's the fact that personality she's narcissistic, she's demanding, she's insistent, she's, I could go on again. But it is exactly that she is all of those things that makes her such a vulnerable subject and enables us to see through her. If she weren't all those things, she probably, wouldn't have resisted so hard or would have been tougher. So it is the personality that enables us to see the history behind it, or that opens up that history. So,
Jim Grossman.
Yes, I it seems to me that part of the key to that is your relationship with her and to her. Other than saying you weren't writing a biography, the first time you mentioned her name, she was Lillian. And then for the rest of your talk, she was either Lillian Hellman or her or she until the very end, in which she became Lillian again. So it seems to me that part of the, and you see this in many biographies, the ways in which during the text, at certain points, somebody is the first name and then they're not, and it usually matters. So I'm curious about how your relationship with her developed over time. And I think the second part of this is that it seems to me that you dislike her, but you admire her. And
Yes.
that's what you're doing here. And at the same time, you're also writing a biography of somebody who constructed her own self in the same way, say, Sojourner Truth did, that Nell Painter had that same task, or Elliot Gorn had that task with Mother Jones, taking somebody who constructed a narrative of their life and trying to reconstruct it in a different way.
Yeah. The end question, the liking question. Everybody says to me, how can you write a biography about somebody you dislike? How can you? And I say, I don't dislike her, and I don't like her either, but I do admire her. I do admire her. And I don't dislike her because I can see both sides of the personality. And I have met and talked to many people who, you know, will in the same breath say to me, oh, she had such an ugly temper, or she would disrupt a dinner party by yelling at somebody at the end of the table, 12 people at dinner, and she would yell at some side comment. She would say, you're wrong, she would say, and stop the entire dinner party. You can't like a woman like that either, but at the same time as people tell you those stories, they will say to you, but I loved her, So I will say, so why'd you invite her to the next dinner party? And they'll say, I loved her, right? She was funny. She had a great sense of humor. She always lifted the spirits in a room. So I don't think it's about liking or disliking. Why do I call her Lillian sometimes and sometimes? And there I decided as I was writing the book, and I caught myself doing this, that I would just let it happen. I call her Lillian when I'm feeling close to her or when the context makes it desirable to call her Lillian. But most of the time in the book, I'm calling her Hellman by her last name. When she's writing plays or when she's, resisting committees, I don't call her Lillian then. I call her Lillian when I'm speaking about her persona. And so far, my editor hasn't stopped me. When that happens, then I don't know what I'll do. I'll call you up, Jim, and say, what should I do?
Ron Steele.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. You said that she was non-feminine. And I've, just from my one contact, I met her just once, very late in her life, and I was relatively young then. And the impression I got from her was very strong and very striking. She was flirtatious. I don't think that's a non-feminine quality. She was very likable. Now, she would, this was when she was living on the vineyard among friends, so she wasn't offensive. But I think the femininity appears in her plays, and she was very capable of using it, and I think, from my own experience, successfully.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about that. She was very flirtatious and very charming, or she could be very flirtatious and very charming. And the people, for example, when I interviewed Peter Feebleman, who was her companion for 20-odd years, and who was 25 years younger than he spent an entire hour really convincing me that I had to understand this part of her or I would never understand her. So I have written about that. And I think that that's true in her personal life, most of her personal life. She was also very sexual and very sexually. Later in her life, when people were out to get her, they called her a sexual predator. Was the, very sexual in a male. I mean, I'm sorry about the binaries, but it's easy shorthand. I know. Sorry, but we only have 5 minutes. But in a typically, she went after the people that she wanted. And indeed, it speaks well of you that she was flirtatious when you were around. Because if she hadn't been attracted somehow, she probably wouldn't have been flirtatious. She did use, that was a guile, a conscious tactic. But then there was the other side of her. So when you talk to people who knew her in the theater, for example, Austin Pendleton, who directed one of her plays while she was still alive, so the play in which Elizabeth Taylor, The Little Foxes, 1981 production, that Elizabeth Taylor, and so he had Elizabeth Taylor and Lillian Hellman on the same platform. And Pendleton said to me, Pendleton loved her. But he said to me, she was the most strident woman he had ever encountered, that she would, he described one incident when she came out of a dress rehearsal for The Little Foxes, and she was so angry with what she'd seen. This is a dress rehearsal, there's an audience there, that she walks out at intermission and she bangs her cane, which by then she's carrying, against the wall, and she says, "This is the worst fucking evening of my life," in just those words. And it was Pendleton who said to me, it's that kind of behavior that made people, argue that she acted like a man, that she just, so yes, she was charming and flirtatious and funny and warm and generous and all those things. And at the same time, when she was in public, when she wanted something, when she was in a demanding mood, she was very masculine. It's the word that everybody used to describe her. And in the book, I duck the responsibility of claiming it for myself and attribute it to all the people who quoted it to me. But I think that's probably the way it was.
Alice, we're getting short of time. I wonder whether it would be all right if we would collect some comments and then get you to respond. Let me begin with Charlie Mayer and then Al Kraut.
You started at the beginning by saying the biography was sort of a vehicle, may not be the right word, but a way of using it. And then increasingly you got into the personality and the contradictoriness and contrariness of this, protagonist, who is obviously very fascinating. But I have two questions. They're related, I guess. And one is, the more you can't sunder them, but when you get a personality who is so full of contrarieties in some ways, mustn't it limit to some degree anything you can generalize about the ideological canvas, which is obviously of great interest to you? And the second question is precisely about that canvas. I mean, you spent a lot of time explaining why you could be people of good faith could be communists in the late 30s, and I certainly agree. I mean, and perhaps longer, but I think somehow the passions, why this politics as passion about this issue, and of course it revives again and again after 1980s, again. I mean, people who were radicals in the late 60s are now asking everybody to abjure the gods they worshipped. I mean, the dimensions of the political passion behind this particular ideology and what it represented. I don't know whether you'll get into that, but it seems to me this is so critical for the history that we've lived in.
Yeah, Alice, as you were talking, I was thinking of the night, my earliest political memory, the night that Joseph, the night that Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were executed. And it wasn't so much the execution that impressed me, but the neighbors. Everyone in the tenement where we lived, everyone in the streets the next day. The pain, the agony, the controversy, the remarks, both kindly and snotty and every conceivable range. It strikes me that what you're writing is really not a window on a time, but a window on minds and emotions that are connected to radicalism and connected especially to communism in the 20th century. And that in many ways she epitomizes all of these feelings and all the contradictions, because there were so many for those who were engaged in the movement, of reconciling feelings about Stalinism and feeling about the broader agenda of the revolution and so on. And that's it. It's not a window on the times, but what I wrote in my notes was sort of a window on a tortured mind, on tortured minds, radical minds of the era.
I'm afraid we only have time for a couple more comments. Jim Banner is insisting on a... Oh, no, yes.
Marjorie, too.
Yeah, and Marjorie.
Alice, following up Charlie's question, in using Hellman as a window into various aspects of 20th century history, the first one you started with, Popular Front, you were able to claim that she wasn't representative, but she was part of maybe a quarter of the population. But that theme began to drop from the rest of your remarks, and I think I would like to know, or I urge you as you're writing this, to be willing to state to what degree, if she's not representative, she is the carrier or emblematic of certain themes in our national history in the 20th century.
And our last comment, Marjorie.
I was just really, Marjorie Sproul, I'm very interested in your counterphobic theory and its relation to her Southern past. And I was just wondering about this idea that maybe her fear deep inside of being a woman alone, dependent only on herself, made her behave in such a counter-feminine way. And that, because she was reared in the South, where Southern women were, taught from infancy that bargain, that, you had to give deference in return for protection. But if you violated that ideal of ladylike behavior, then the consequences were enormous, including a loss of protection. So then perhaps she deliberately, in every way she can, at least publicly, deliberately violates that feminine ideal in terms of sexuality, being shrewish, irritable, even masculine, as you say. So then after she crosses that line and thus gives up the protection, then of course she would be terrified of going before whack and losing her means of supporting herself.
So, I have a minute to reply. Let me respond to Marjorie first, because it's the outlier in some ways of these questions. The book has 11 chapters, of which 2 deal with the communist or radical issue, one in the 30s and then one in the war and post-war period. One deals with her as a woman growing up in the South. One deals with her as a Jew. One deals with her as a so-called self-made woman. There are a couple that deal with her as a playwright. And so the thing that I want to make clear is that the question about ideology, the politics, it's a very important piece, and it's some ways it's threaded through the book, but it's by no means the only piece. On the southern piece, yes and no. She grows up in the South and she claims the South as her heritage, and she cooks Southern food. She's a great cook, and gumbos, Louisiana cooking, is her specialty, and everybody loves it and comes to see it and, I mean, to partake of it. And she imagines herself always as a Southern woman. She crosses her ankles in just the right way when she sits. She's very proud of her slim ankles and her, and she has a very, she's small, she's 5'3" and slender. So although her face is often described as masculine, that's not my word, she certainly has a very sensuous body. But she doesn't have money and she doesn't have beauty in the classic sense. So when she comes of age into the flapper period, and she's a free woman. She is immediately sexually active in a culture in which sexual activity is, for young women, is no longer frowned on, except by her mother. So she hides her sexual activity from her mother, who is a very Southern woman. And even when she starts living with Dashiell Hammett, when she divorces her husband, she's 25 years old. Her mother doesn't know for a while afterwards. And eventually she goes down to New Orleans to tell her father's sisters, who then tell her parents. In other words, she does have this sort of obeisance to those Southern values. But she knows she's transgressing them, and as she transgresses them, she does so in, you might say, in some of the same ways she acts politically. She's counterphobic. She knows she's transgressing them, and yet she maintains this outward, the flirtatiousness, the charm, the hospitality. All that's real at the same time as though there is this inner steel core in which she's a woman alone. Even when she's with Dash Hammett and Dash Hammett is making money, they are supporting each other ultimately. When she buys her first house, she buys that house. Hammett doesn't buy the house, she buys the house. That's very unusual in 1939 for a single woman to go around by, she didn't inherit it. She didn't, she took the money she earned and she bought the house. So the answer to your question is yes, yes, and yes. You get 3 yeses for that. Just quickly, the question about the passion in her politics. Charlie's question and then Al's question, which, if you don't mind, I'll combine. And maybe Jim's question first. Was she representative or not? I just don't generally describe her as representative. I usually describe her as a lightning rod. I say that what she does is she sort of gathers in her body some of the most controversial tensions of the 20th century. Some of them have to do with politics, but some have to do with the changing role of women, and some have to do with what it meant to be a Jew, and particularly a Southern Jew in that period. Some have to do with what it meant to be a female playwright in that period when there were no serious female playwrights on Broadway. In order to be a female playwright, you had to write these fuzzy, funny, domestic comedies, basically. So, on the Popular Front issue, I think it's not so much that she's representative as it is that there, too, she is gathering a piece of the storm, as it were. She's getting attacked for being a communist at a moment when, what's going on is unclear to all of us, and that we'd better look at what else is going on, not just what she's being attacked for. the passion in her politics, the ideology of the politics. She's not a passionate communist, that's for sure. She's briefly a member of the party. She tells us at one point, or she tells Joseph Rao, and Joseph Rao caught a record of it, that she tells him she was in the party, but she couldn't stand it because she didn't adhere. She couldn't. She was never a disciplined person. She couldn't adhere to somebody else's discipline. She had her own discipline. Indeed, she joins the party in 1939 before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. She doesn't quit during the Hitler-Stalin Pact when everybody else is quitting, and she quits in late 1941 after the Soviet Union has attacked after Germany has attacked the Soviet Union at a time when everybody else is joining, or, you know. But despite when she joins and when she quits, she nevertheless remains the same person. So she defends the Soviet Union for signing the pact in a kind of lukewarm way. She says, things like, well, what were you supposed to do? We knew that, the Soviet Union needed to buy some time, and this was a way to buy some time. So why shouldn't they buy time this way? And then she goes and she writes the Watch on the Rhine, which is an anti-fascist play, which the Communist Party, which she is then a member of, rejects, and says, why is she writing this anti-fascist play when the Soviet Union is allied with fascism? And she responds by saying, basically, I don't give a hoot what the Soviet Union is allied with. Fascism is what I care about, and I'm going to attack it in whatever ways I can attack it. So the passions are not passions. I have not seen in anything that she wrote any passion for the Soviet Union or for communism per se. I have seen a lot of passion for some of the issues, for anti-racism, for anti-fascism, for social egalitarian policies of one kind or another. And on those issues, and for civil liberties, and on those issues, she remains completely consistent, for 40 years, even as the Soviet Union changes its policies. And that's why my sense that, to call her an unregenerate Stalinist that's the politics of the moment. So it was Charles, I think, who asked, so why did everybody hate her so much? Or why if she really wasn't so passionate, was she accused of that? Oh, right. Okay, but let me just briefly say to that there is that what she was passionate about was this anti-communist thing. And what got her in the end, and what led the right wing, the Norman Podhoritzes, the Irving Howes, the Arthur Schlesingers, and so on, to attack her at the end of her life, and Mary McCarthy, who was a Trotskyist most of this time, to attack her at the end of the life, was precisely that she was attacking them for being anti-communist. And that's where the passion comes from, that she was passionate in defense of the right to speak. And they had fallen short. They'd been tested in the McCarthy period and had not spoken up or had joined the anti-communist ranks. And I have one last sentence.
Okay.
I have a wonderful, I did some digging into the relationship between Mary McCarthy and Lillian Hellman, and it turns out that they have a relationship that goes back to 1937, that it took a kind of crisscross relationship in which took many different forms, was always a relationship of enmity, and was around many different issues, but began as a relationship on the Spanish Civil War, that Hellman would not repudiate the Republicans or the Abraham Lincoln Brigade even after it was clear that the Soviets were killing their own people, essentially. And Mary McCarthy, Dwight McDonald, that crew did immediately walked away from it. And then after that, the Trotskyist campaigns and so on. So their political history crisscrossed, I wouldn't say passionately, but crisscrossed in so many ways that by the time the issue, of the lies came up, it was not about lying at all, even though that was its service thing. It was about the political differences that had gone on for 40 years before.
Alice, thank you.
Thank you.